There are certain mornings in the Montana mountains when the air itself seems to tremble, when the wind thrashes through the pines so violently that it drowns out all memory of calm. The dawn Clara Monroe awoke to was just such a morning. Wind rattled the tin roof of the old ranger station, making it sound like the forest itself was demanding to be let inside. Clara stood alone by the window, the light of a single lantern flickering against the thick glass, hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug she barely tasted. She'd slept, if you could call it that, curled up in her ranger's jacket on the battered old cot, the past gnawing at her like some small, persistent animal. Every night, her mind wandered back to the same memory, the final search for her brother, the hope growing fainter with every crackle of the radio, every footprint that led nowhere. The forest never gave him back. She wore the grief like an invisible cloak, heavy and hard to shed. Outside, the wind howled through the firs, carrying the scent of distant wildfire and the sharp warning of smoke. She checked the map tacked to the wall. The Redwater Range, her domain for the past 6 years, sprawled in blue ink and thumbtacks, already scarred with burn zones and rescue trails. "High alert," the radio said at midnight. The fire could change course with the wind, and every ranger in Montana knew what that meant. Be ready. She was pouring another mug of coffee, trying to will her hands steady, when she heard it. At first, Clara thought it was thunder, deep, rolling, too early for the storm they'd forecasted. But it grew, rhythm-building, pounding like a drum against the morning hush. Her grip on the coffee pot froze, mid-pour, drops spattering on the floor. She listened, heart thumping, every nerve strung taut. The sound was closer now, hooves on gravel, frantic, then skidding, then silence so sudden she nearly dropped the mug. Adrenaline spiked. Clara rushed to the door, fumbling for her flashlight. As she pulled the heavy wooden door open, the early light revealed a sight that made her heart clutch in her chest. A horse, no, a stallion, chestnut brown and lathered in sweat, stood wild-eyed in the swirling wind. His nostrils flared, sides heaving as if he'd galloped for miles without pause. Mud and blood streaked his flanks, the whites of his eyes rolling with fear. The wind whipped his mane across his face, and for a second Clara wondered if he was real, or just another ghost conjured by sleeplessness and sorrow. He took one stumbling step, then collapsed with a thud onto the gravel, legs folding beneath him as if he simply couldn't run any further. Clara moved forward cautiously, years of training warring with the deep, primal ache in her chest. She knelt in the dirt, boots scraping, heart hammering so hard she was sure the stallion could hear it. "Easy, easy now," she whispered, reaching out a hand, the way she would with a spooked animal or a panicked child. The horse's chest rose and fell in jagged bursts. Blood seeped from a fresh gash along his right flank, painting the tan fur dark. Around his neck, something odd, something that didn't belong, caught the weak dawn light. Clara leaned closer. A strip of faded blue cloth, knotted around a weathered leather halter, hung like a desperate talisman, and dangling from the cloth, tied in a clumsy knot, was the strap of a small backpack. A child's backpack. Clara's blood ran cold. For an instant, the world shrank to the horse, the cloth, and the distant echo of a child's scream she'd never managed to reach in time. Panic rose, sharp and old and hungry. She forced herself to breathe, to focus, to see what was in front of her, not what her memory wanted her to see. The horse's eyes rolled toward her. There was something in them. Pain, yes, but also an urgency, a message he couldn't voice. Clara reached for her radio, fumbling with the buttons. "This is Ranger Monroe at Redwater Outpost. I have an injured horse, possible wild, but there's a child's backpack strap." Her voice faltered as the realization hit her. There was no way this stallion got that cloth and that strap on his own. He'd come from somewhere. He was trying to say something. The horse's ears flicked back, then forward, nostrils flaring as if scenting a path only he could follow. He tried to rise, staggering, muscles trembling. Clara looked at the frayed cloth, the backpack strap, pink with faded butterflies. She reached for it, hands shaking, the way they always did when she thought of her brother and the last search. She had failed once. She wouldn't fail again. The wind shifted, carrying the distant wail of a siren. Smoke curled low over the ridgeline. The horse tossed his head and made a guttural sound, more plea than command. Clara's mind raced. If a child was out there, lost in the path of the fire, minutes mattered. The morning dawned with a strange hush, the kind that comes only after the land has been through fire and rain. Mist drifted in low waves through the redwater pines. The air tasted new, cleansed, but beneath it lingered an undercurrent of tension, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for old wounds to surface. Clara stood at the ranger cabin's window, watching the mist roll past the porch as she wrapped her brother's compass in her fist. She felt the weight of the logbook, her brother's patch, and every question that had clawed at her for years. Today she would walk into the one place she had spent her life avoiding, the aspen grove where the trail had gone cold, the place where her brother vanished and her hope nearly died. Chestnut paced in the yard, ears alert, as if he too sensed the day's significance. The children were safe. Harper had recovered enough to help the boy braid Chestnut's mane with dandelions, but Clara knew she couldn't delay any longer. She'd promised herself she would face the grove, for her brother, for Chestnut, and for the truths no one else would touch. Before she left, Harper approached, slipping a folded piece of paper into Clara's hand. It was a drawing, 2 figures, one tall and one small, beneath golden trees, with a horse standing watch. "For luck," Harper whispered. Clara tucked it into her pocket and squeezed the girl's shoulder. "I'll be back soon." With Chestnut at her side, Clara set out. They moved along a narrow game trail that wound uphill under a canopy of trembling aspen leaves. The grove was notorious among rangers, a beautiful spot haunted by loss. The ground sloped gently, roots curling out of the earth like pale fingers. Clara's boots sank into spongy moss as she stepped beneath the golden-green light, her heart pounding. Chestnut halted at the edge of the grove. He stood utterly still, ears flicked forward, body tense. Then, with sudden determination, he started pawing at the soil, his hoof scraping away leaves and loam in steady, forceful strokes. Clara felt a chill ripple through her. The horse knew, he remembered. Every muscle in her body screamed with dread, but she forced herself forward, falling to her knees beside him. "Okay, buddy," she breathed, voice tight. "Show me." She helped Chestnut scrape at the ground, hands soon dirty and trembling. A few inches down, her fingers struck something hard, cold metal. She dug faster, ignoring the sting of broken nails. Soon a battered tin box emerged, its lid rusted but intact. Clara brushed it clean and traced the initials scratched on top. SM, her brother's box. Chestnut let out a low, anxious nicker and nudged the soil again. Clara pried open the tin. Inside, faded by time, were 2 things: a compass identical to her own, and a photograph of her and her brother, arms slung around each other, grinning beneath the very aspens that now watched over them. Tears blurred Clara's vision. She clutched the photograph to her chest, the ache in her heart sharp and sweet. But Chestnut wasn't done. He pawed at the earth, more frantic now. Clara joined in, her hands shaking. The soil here was softer, as if the ground itself had been disturbed and healed over. A few more inches, and her fingers brushed something rough and unyielding. Bones. The breath left Clara's lungs. She sat back, shaking, as the reality crashed over her. Chestnut whinnied, circling close, nudging her with his muzzle as if to say, "You're not alone." I stayed. I remembered. Clara swallowed her terror and forced herself to look. The bones were small, animal, not human, she realized with a shudder of relief. But beside them, wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth, was a tangle of leather, an old lanyard holding her brother's badge. Her vision swam. Every sound faded except her own heartbeat and the wind whispering through the aspens. She lifted the badge, mud-caked and scarred, and pressed it to her lips. "You tried to come home," she choked out. "You tried." Chestnut dropped to his knees, pressing his nose to the earth, eyes soft and ancient. Clara understood suddenly what the stallion had done. He'd stayed here in this haunted grove for days after the chaos, the only witness to what happened, waiting for someone to listen, to see what was hidden beneath the aspen roots. A rustle in the trees snapped Clara from her reverie. She spun, half expecting Elias Drake or some other shadow from her nightmares to appear. But it was only a family of deer, passing silently, pausing to watch her with dark, liquid eyes before bounding away. Still, Clara's nerves were raw. She slipped the tin box, compass, photo, and badge into her backpack and dusted off her hands. For a long time, she simply sat in the grove, Chestnut pressed close against her side. The sunlight filtered down, dappling the earth, turning the pain of memory into something softer, almost bearable. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. Why was the lanyard buried here, with the box and animal bones? Had her brother hidden it, or had someone else tried to erase the last traces of his trail? Did Chestnut witness everything, the violence, the cover-up, the abandonment? Clara stroked the horse's mane, voice breaking as she whispered, "I wish you could talk." But then she realized Chestnut had spoken, in his way. He had led her here again and again, refusing to leave, refusing to let her forget. His memory was sharper than any human's, a living testimony to what the world tried to hide. At last, Clara stood, knees stiff, and turned for home. Chestnut walked beside her, his head low. Clara always dreaded the aspen grove, had dreaded it for years, though she could never say the words out loud. It was beautiful, that stretch of trembling gold and white trunks hidden deep in the Redwater Range. But beneath the soft, fluttering leaves, the ground felt different, older, sadder, haunted. It was here, all those years ago, that her brother's trail had vanished, that hope had curdled to heartbreak. And it was here, she now realized, that Chestnut had waited and remembered far longer than any ranger or rescue dog ever could. That morning, the air was almost too still. Dew clung to the grass, and every breath Clara took seemed to echo. She left Harper and the young boy at the cabin, safe for now, and walked with Chestnut at her side, following a path she'd avoided for too long. The stallion was calm but alert, his stride purposeful, as if he understood that this was not just another patrol. It was the journey both of them needed to make. They passed through thickets of pine, past the old split boulder her brother had once dubbed the Guardian Stone. Here Clara paused, pressing her palm to the cold granite, feeling the faintest pulse of memory. Chestnut snorted, impatient, nudging her forward with a gentle shove of his nose. The aspen grove opened before them, sunlight dappling through golden leaves. roots like ghostly veins stretching across the mossy floor. Clara stopped, breath hitching, heart thundering in her chest. She could see it all again, the lines of searchers fanning out, the radio static, her brother's laugh echoing and then cut off by silence. Grief tightened its grip, but she pressed on. Chestnut halted suddenly, just before a patch of soft, recently disturbed earth. He pawed at the ground, snorting, glancing back at Clara with an urgency that brooked no denial. She knelt beside him, hands trembling, and began to clear the earth away, pushing aside leaves and pebbles. The stallion joined her, scraping with his hooves, the two of them united in a silent, desperate excavation. After a few minutes, Clara's fingers brushed against something hard, a small, battered tin box caked with mud. Her breath caught as she wiped it clean, reading the familiar initials scratched into the lid. SM, her brother's box. She fumbled the lid open. Inside were scraps of memory, a faded photograph of them both, grinning beneath the aspens, a keychain compass, glass cracked, a strip of blue cloth. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She pressed the photo to her heart, the ache of loss mingling with the fragile joy of discovery. But Chestnut wasn't finished. He pawed again, more urgently, snorting, whinnying low. Clara, guided by his insistence, dug deeper. This time her hands met something even colder, a tangle of old bones, weathered but unmistakably human. A wave of shock and sorrow swept over her. She knelt in the dirt, staring at what she'd uncovered, bones wrapped in a faded ranger's jacket, a badge barely visible beneath the grime. Her brother's badge. Clara's hands shook as she lifted it, unable to speak. The truth was undeniable. Her brother had never left the grove. He'd lain here all along, waiting for someone to find him. Chestnut dropped to his knees beside her, pressing his head gently against her shoulder. For a long moment, Clara wept, the horse holding vigil as the morning sun climbed higher, painting gold across her tears. The silence of the grove was absolute, a sacred hush that honored pain, memory, and loyalty beyond words. Clara found herself whispering to her brother, words she'd never said before, letting her grief and guilt spill out. "I'm sorry, Sam. I should have listened. I should have kept looking." The forest offered no answer but the wind in the leaves and the warm, steady presence of Chestnut at her side. It struck her then, what the horse had done. Chestnut had stayed in this grove for days, maybe longer, after Sam disappeared. He had witnessed everything, the frantic search, the quiet abandonment, the truth the world refused to see. He had remembered it all, carrying the weight of it in every scar and every hesitant step. He had waited, knowing someone would return, someone who needed the answers as much as he needed to give them. Clara lifted the badge, brushing dirt from its surface, and pinned it to Chestnut's saddle blanket beside her brother's old patch. It was a small, trembling gesture, but it felt like closure, like a promise to both horse and brother that she would not let the truth stay buried. As she sat in the grove, sun warming her back, Clara realized that the bones beneath the aspens would change everything. The evidence was here undeniable, impossible for Redwater's authorities to ignore. But more than that, she felt the old ache inside her finally begin to ease. There was pain, yes, but also a strange relief, a sense that, with Chestnut's help, she had finally come home, and so had her brother. She spent a long time beside the grave, speaking to Sam, telling him of everything she'd learned. Chestnut's courage, Elias Drake's cruelty, the rescue of the children, the promise of justice. She knew she'd have to face the sheriff, the press, the town's suspicions. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Grief had made her fierce, and Chestnut had made her brave. As Clara and Chestnut turned to leave, she paused at the edge of the grove, looking back one last time. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the earth with golden light. The grove was no longer a place of nightmares. It was a place of memory, of loyalty, of truth brought into the open. Clara led Chestnut back down the trail, the badge glinting on his saddle, the tin box and photo tucked safe in her pack. She felt her brother's compass steady in her hand, the needle trembling but finally pointing home. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. Beneath the aspens, the past had finally spoken, and with Chestnut by her side, Clara was ready to carry that truth forward, no matter what storms might come. Redwater had always seemed like a town out of time, half mountain legend, half stubborn reality. By the time Clara guided Chestnut and the two children into the heart of town, news of her discovery had already begun to ripple outward, carried by radio static, hurried phone calls, and the anxious whispers of neighbors peering from behind curtained windows. The revelation from the aspen grove, the return of Sam Monroe's badge, and the battered logbook burned through Redwater like wildfire. There would be no more silence. The Civic Center, a squat brick building on Main Street, was packed beyond its fire code. Sheriff Durant stood at the front, jaw set, arms folded over his chest. There were search and rescue volunteers, townsfolk, reporters from the county paper, and a handful of government officials who had swept in on the earliest flight. Faces pale, eyes scanning the crowd with the nervous wariness of men who'd hidden too many secrets for too long. Clara had barely slept, her nerves stretched raw, but she stood tall with Chestnut at her side, the horse's calm presence grounding her. The children, freshly scrubbed and wearing borrowed clothes, sat near the front, flanked by social workers. Harper squeezed Clara's hand as the meeting came to order. The sheriff's voice was gravelly but clear. Redwater's had its share of sorrow. Today, we face it. Ranger Monroe, would you please tell us what you found? Clara took a breath, feeling every eye on her. A week ago, I followed a wounded horse, Chestnut, into the forest after a storm. I found 2 lost children alive because this horse led me to them. But that wasn't all. Chestnut brought me back to the aspen grove. Her voice trembled but did not break. Where my brother's trail ended years ago. There we found evidence. His badge, a box of personal effects, and his remains. A murmur rippled through the crowd, part grief, part relief. For some, it was closure. For others, the reopening of old wounds. Clara pressed on, holding up the battered logbook for all to see. This is a record of the Redwater Obedience Trials, a project that used horses like Chestnut for experimental training. Many didn't survive. Those who did were marked as expendable. The names in this book match the horses and rangers who disappeared. My brother tried to protect Chestnut. He paid for it. Elias Drake, seated in the back, tried to rise, but 2 deputies blocked his path. His face was hard as granite, but in his eyes, Clara saw fear, not fury. Sheriff Durant motioned for silence, then nodded to a deputy, who collected the logbook and the evidence from Clara. We will open a formal investigation into the Redwater Project and all personnel involved, including Mr. Drake. Clara watched as the children were asked to speak. Harper, voice thin but determined, described the days she and the boy spent lost, the sound of Chestnut's hooves in the dark, the way the stallion shielded them from cold and fear. He kept coming back for us, she said. He wouldn't leave, even when we were too scared to move. A hush fell as Elias Drake was led to the front, flanked by deputies. Sheriff Durant spoke first. "Mr. Drake, do you have anything to say?" Elias glared at Clara, then at the horse, and for a moment it seemed he might refuse. But something in the silence, or maybe the weight of years spent hiding, cracked him open. "We did what we were told," he muttered. "We were told to make survivors. I lost good men, good horses. We all did." He paused, voice breaking, and for the first time Clara saw not a villain, but a ruined man. Still responsible, but broken by what he'd done. The sheriff nodded, somber. "Your choices will have consequences." As deputies led Elias away, Clara felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-tired sorrow. She knelt beside Chestnut, fastening Sam's badge to the horse's halter. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, a silent tribute to the courage, sacrifice, and memory that had brought them here. The aftermath was a blur. Officials collecting evidence, reporters snapping photos, townsfolk offering embraces and quiet apologies. Clara found herself surrounded by old search and rescue friends, each one pressing her hand, thanking her for her courage. "You brought Sam home," one whispered. "You brought us all home." Later that day, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, a small ceremony was held at the edge of the Civic Center green. Chestnut stood at the front, head high, as Clara pinned the badge to his halter for all to see. The mayor read a proclamation honoring the horse as Ranger Delta, Survivor and Savior. "In recognition of a service beyond words, we name you Redwater's own. Let the record show. Memory can save when silence would have doomed us all." Tears streaked Clara's face as she watched townsfolk, young and old, come forward to lay wildflowers at Chestnut's feet and touch Sam's badge. The children clung to her, and even the stoniest men tipped their hats. There was grief, but also pride. Redwater had lost much, but it had found the truth. That was something. That evening, back at the cabin, Clara poured herself a mug of coffee and sat with the children and Chestnut, listening as Harper read letters from neighboring towns. Survivors from other wilderness programs, riders, rangers, and families, wrote to thank her for bringing their pain into the open. "We thought no one cared," one letter said. "Now we know you did, and that's enough." Clara stared at Chestnut, his scars visible but his eyes gentle. She stroked his mane, whispering, "You were always more than they saw. You remembered for all of us." Harper approached with a shy smile. "Will Chestnut stay with us?" Clara nodded. "If he chooses, he has a home here. He's earned it." As dusk settled, Clara stood at the window, watching the sky change from gold to blue. For the first time since Sam disappeared, she felt the tightness in her chest ease. Justice would not erase the pain, but it would help them all start again. The cabin door opened and a neighbor stepped in, holding a new letter. "From the Bureau," he said, "Chestnut, Ranger Delta, has been recognized for his service. They want to start a new program, one that honors memory, not obedience. Will you help?" Clara smiled through her tears. "Of course," she said, looking at Chestnut, then at the children. "That's all I ever wanted." Outside, Redwater's Civic Center glowed with new hope. A town once silent was awake, alive, ready to remember, and finally, to heal. A few months had passed since the aspen grove gave up its silence and Redwater finally learned the truth. Now, under a sky bluer than anything Clara could remember, she stood at the podium of the Montana Trauma Recovery Conference, a gathering of rangers, rescue workers, counselors, survivors, and animal advocates. The crowd filled the small auditorium, but the front row belonged to Chestnut, who watched with serene dignity, a living testament to memory and endurance. Clara glanced down at her notes, her hands steady, her heart surprisingly calm. She'd spoken in public before, debriefings, briefings, school visits, but never like this. Never with the rawness and honesty demanded of her today. The title projected behind her read, "When Memory Walks on Four Legs." It was more than a keynote. It was a confession, a tribute, and a challenge. She began not with a statistic or a quote, but with the truth. There's a silence that comes after loss, a heavy, invisible thing. Most of us carry it in our bones, hoping no one sees how it slows our step or darkens our view. I carried it after losing my brother. I carried it even as I hiked, worked, tried to save other people's families. I carried it honestly, until a wounded horse brought it right to my door and refused to let me turn away. A ripple ran through the audience, fellow rangers nodding, a therapist dabbing at her eyes, Harper and the young boy, now braver, stronger, sitting with their foster parents, giving Chestnut encouraging glances. Clara continued, voice steady. Chestnut wasn't just a survivor. He was a messenger. He bore the scars of cruelty, but more importantly, he bore witness. He remembered when so many tried to forget. Clara gestured to a screen where images flickered. Chestnut's battered side, her brother's compass, the tin box from the grove, the children standing in the dawn light. We talk a lot about survival, about grit, resilience, getting back up after we fall. But I want to talk about something else, about what it means to remember, about how refusing to forget, even when it hurts, is sometimes the bravest act of all. She let the words settle, watching Chestnut shift his weight, the patch of Sam's badge still pinned to his halter. You see, in our line of work, we're told to move on quickly. We see pain, we treat it, we file it away. Horses were treated the same way, trained, tested, discarded. Chestnut was branded non-compliant and marked for disposal. But he didn't let go of what he saw or the people he loved. He didn't obey, because sometimes obedience is the enemy of justice. A murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Clara's voice grew stronger. Chestnut's silence wasn't emptiness. It was resistance. Every day he waited near the aspen grove, he was refusing to let the truth die. He could have wandered away, but he stayed. He waited for someone who cared enough to listen, someone stubborn enough maybe to understand. Clara paused, letting the emotional weight build. She reached into her bag and withdrew the tin box, holding it up for the audience. Inside here is all that was left of my brother when we found him. But what Chestnut gave back was so much more than a box or a badge. He gave us memory. He gave us justice. Now she looked directly at the rows of faces. How many of us here have met a messenger like that? Someone or something that arrives battered, silent, maybe a little broken, but persistent. How many of us ignore those messengers because the truth they bring is inconvenient, or painful, or disruptive? A hush fell. Clara pressed on, not flinching from the hard part. We failed these animals and these children by insisting that healing means forgetting. Chestnut taught me that healing means honoring what happened, even when it hurts, and letting it shape what we do next. She clicked to the next slide, a close-up of Chestnut's scars, then a wider shot of him standing with the children in the Civic Center, head high, sunlight gleaming off Sam's badge. He didn't survive because he was obedient. He survived because he was stubborn, because he refused to leave those who needed him, because he remembered for all of us. Clara's voice softened, carrying the story home. I don't stand here today because I found my brother's compass, or because Chestnut led me into the woods. I stand here because for the first time I let myself listen to Chestnut, to the children, to my own grief. And I let that memory guide me, not as a burden, but as a torch. There was a long, respectful silence. Then she closed with a challenge, her voice steady and full of hope. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Sometimes healing doesn't roar. Sometimes it waits quietly, scarred but unbroken, until we're ready to listen. And when memory finally walks up to us, on 4 legs or 2, what we choose to do in that moment is everything. Don't turn away from the silent messengers. Follow them. Listen. Honor what they show you, no matter how hard it is. The applause was quiet at first, then thunderous. Clara stepped down, letting the next speaker prepare, and knelt beside Chestnut in the aisle. The stallion nudged her, soft and insistent. She smiled, feeling lighter, unburdened by the weight of secrets. After her talk, people crowded to thank her, to ask about Chestnut, to share their own stories of pain and resilience. Harper hugged her fiercely, tears running down her cheeks. "You helped me talk again," the girl whispered. "You and Chestnut." Clara stroked the girl's hair, her own eyes shining. "You helped me too. All of us did this together." As the day wound down, Clara joined a circle of rangers and counselors under the cottonwoods outside. They spoke not just of horses or tragedy, but of what comes next, of new training programs, support for survivors, and honoring the memories of those lost and found. Chestnut stood among them, as much a leader as any human. That evening, Clara and Chestnut walked out beneath the Montana stars, the badge glinting in the moonlight. The pain would never be gone, but now it was held in the open, transformed into purpose. She realized then, memory, when honored, is not a weight, but a bridge. And sometimes, the greatest justice comes from refusing to let silence win. As she brushed Chestnut's mane and whispered a final thank you, she knew that her brother, the children, and every forgotten soul in those woods had finally been seen, heard, and remembered, carried forward, not just by one determined horse, but by a whole community awakened by the power of memory. By autumn, Redwater had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Where the forest once held secrets and sorrow, it now held possibility, a sense of renewal. The wildfire scars had begun to heal, and in the heart of the valley, a new trail was being cleared, winding along the ridge where Chestnut had once run, past the aspen grove, all the way to a wide-open meadow where the town gathered to honor what had been lost and what had been found. They called it Chestnut's Path, a memorial trail, and beside it, a modest equine rescue center. The grand opening was a sunlit Saturday, the kind of day where the air smelled of pine needles and sweet hay, and the mountains stood guard, blue and eternal. Clara stood at the trailhead, her ranger's badge pinned beside Sam's on her vest, her heart a mix of grief and pride. Chestnut stood with her, calm and strong, a living symbol of resilience. Children ran along the new fences, laughter ringing where once there had been only fear. Harper, now walking with newfound confidence, held the lead rope for a rescued bay mare. The boy, his real name now spoken freely, helped an elderly volunteer groom one of the younger horses. Clara felt her throat tighten watching them, remembering the frightened faces she'd first led out of the woods, and the way Chestnut had stood over them, a silent guardian. Before the ceremony, Clara placed her brother's old compass at the trailhead, tucking it beside a brass plaque carved with Chestnut's hoofprint. The words on the plaque read, "The past doesn't go away, but if we honor it, it can guide us home." She pressed her fingers to the metal, feeling the cool weight of history and healing. The crowd quieted as the mayor stepped forward. "Today we dedicate Chestnut's Path and the Redwater Equine Rescue Center in honor of those who remember, those who endure, and those who lead us. sometimes silently, sometimes stubbornly, toward the truth. This is more than a trail. It is a promise that no one, human or animal, will be left behind again. Clara spoke next, her words simple, her voice steady. For a long time I was afraid to return to the places that hurt me most. I thought if I avoided the grove, if I buried the memories, I could move on. But healing isn't forgetting. Healing is remembering with purpose. It's standing up and saying, "We see you, we remember, and we are here." She looked out over the crowd, neighbors, rangers, survivors, and children, and then to Chestnut, whose eyes met hers with calm understanding. This trail is for everyone who's ever carried pain in silence. It's for those who waited, and for those who found the courage to listen. And it's for Chestnut, who led us back, not just to the truth, but to one another. There was a quiet, powerful moment as the audience reflected. Then the mayor handed Clara a ribbon, and Harper a pair of wooden scissors. Together, they cut the ribbon, and Chestnut led the first group down the new path, pausing to nuzzle the children and accept an apple from a grinning volunteer. Throughout the day, Clara and Harper ran workshops in the small center beside the trail, classes on animal empathy, wilderness safety, and trauma recovery. Harper stood before a circle of kids, holding Chestnut's old halter, her voice clear and sure. "Sometimes it's okay to be afraid," she said, "but you don't have to be alone. If you listen, even to someone who can't speak, you can help each other get home." Clara watched Harper and the boy, now a helper in his own right, guiding a younger child through a breathing exercise. She realized, with a sense of wonder, that the girl who had once whispered only in her sleep now spoke for others, while the boy who had trembled at every shadow now taught others to face their fear. As dusk crept in, the townspeople gathered for a final ceremony at the meadow's edge. The names of the lost were read aloud, including Sam Monroe and others from years past. Each name met with the lighting of a small lantern that was set floating on the pond, its reflection shimmering in the still water. Clara, holding Chestnut's lead, knelt beside the plaque. She placed her brother's compass next to a bunch of wildflowers, her heart full of gratitude and longing. Chestnut lowered his head, his soft breath warm on her cheek, as if to say, "We made it. We're home." In the quiet that followed, Clara felt the weight of the past lift, not erased, but transformed. The pain was still there, but so was something new, a sense of generational healing, a continuity that stretched from her brother's time to the children now laughing and running in the dusk, to Chestnut, who would always be more than a survivor. She rose and turned to address those gathered. "If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Listen to those who can't speak. Stand with those who have carried pain in silence. You never know whose life you'll change, on 2 legs or 4. The crowd applauded, and the children released the last lantern, watching it drift down the stream that bordered the path. The mayor's voice rose in closing. "If you have been moved by Chestnut's story, support a rescue, human or animal. Speak up for those who carry burdens you cannot see. And above all, never underestimate the power of one soul, 4-legged or 2, to change a life." That night, as the crowd dispersed and the mountains faded into blue shadow, Clara lingered at the trailhead with Chestnut. She looked at the path winding ahead, familiar yet full of promise. She knew Sam would never return, but his memory was woven into every step, every lesson, every new beginning. As she led Chestnut down the trail, Harper and the others close behind, Clara felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The silence that had once haunted her now felt like a companion, steady, watchful, full of meaning. Healing didn't always roar. Sometimes it walked beside you, carrying memory, waiting for you to listen, ready to guide you home. And as dusk deepened into night, the lanterns glowed on the water. Chestnut's hoofprints marked the earth, and Clara whispered a quiet promise: to remember, to protect, and to lead others, just as she had been led. She grabbed her field kit, gauze, antiseptic, water, her ranger's jacket, and a faded compass she never left behind, the one that had belonged to her brother. As she tended to the horse's wound, cleaning away blood and dirt, she whispered soothing words, all the while her mind working furiously. She couldn't leave the stallion here to die, but she couldn't ignore what he was telling her either. The horse nosed her arm, eyes wild with urgency. Clara's hands stilled as she saw the mark, a brand, small and almost hidden under the matted fur. Not wild, trained. Someone's horse, but who? Why had he come here, battered, desperate, with a child's strap around his neck? Lightning forked in the sky, thunder rolling over the mountain like a warning. Clara straightened. Decision made. She tossed her kit into her backpack, looped the stallion's reins loosely around her wrist, and grabbed her radio once more. If anyone can hear me, I'm following a lead. Possible missing child. Horse brought in with evidence. Moving out. No response. The wind ate her words, the station crackling with static. Clara met the horse's gaze. All right, buddy, she murmured, her voice steadier now. Show me. With a final ragged breath, the stallion pushed himself up, legs trembling but determined. He took a step toward the trailhead, pausing only to look back at her, as if waiting for her to follow. Clara cinched her jacket tight, bracing against the wind and the ache in her heart. She glanced back once at the ranger station, the safe, lonely box she'd built around her grief. Then she stepped out into the storm, led by a battered horse and a promise she could not break. Above them, the mountains brooded, smoke and fire swirling, dawn just barely breaking. Clara followed the stallion, chestnut, she decided in that moment, for the color of hope and memory, into the woods, chasing the silence and the secrets he carried, her pulse drumming to the rhythm of hooves before dawn. The wind cut sharp as a knife as Clara followed Chestnut out of the ranger station's safety and into the wild swirl of dawn. The old stallion pressed on with a stubborn, silent resolve, moving faster than she expected for an animal so battered. Clara had barely managed to throw her backpack over her shoulder and grab a flashlight, but already she was jogging to keep pace, boots crunching over damp gravel, her breath visible in the chill. The trailhead plunged quickly into a dense tangle of pine wood, the trees hunched together as if conspiring against the daylight. Smoke from the distant wildfire drifted among the trunks, thin and sour. Clara's nerves prickled with every step. She'd walked these trails countless times, on patrol, in search and rescue, and once in hope that had faded to heartbreak. But today, with Chestnut leading the way and fire on the horizon, the woods felt both familiar and treacherous. Chestnut moved with a strange mix of urgency and caution. He hesitated at each fork, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air, then chose the leftmost trail, one less traveled and laced with undergrowth. Clara ducked low-hanging branches and stumbled over hidden roots, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horse. His wound was still oozing blood, and the pink strap from the child's backpack bounced with every step. Whatever had driven him here was more powerful than fear or pain. They climbed a narrow switchback trail, the ground soft and blackened with ash. The air was thick, tasting of burnt resin and something metallic underneath. A branch snapped somewhere ahead, and Clara stopped cold, heart hammering. But Chestnut moved on, head high and ears pricked, muscles twitching with anticipation. After 10 tense minutes, the trail opened into a small, smoke-hazed clearing. Chestnut paused, nostrils flaring, then stomped a forehoof in the loose soil. He glanced back at Clara, his eyes fierce as if commanding her attention. Clara stepped forward cautiously, scanning the edges of the clearing, her ranger's instincts screaming for focus. Then she saw her, a figure lying motionless beneath a thick blanket of pine needles at the edge of a toppled log. The girl's jeans were muddy, her windbreaker torn, and her hair, a tangled halo of blonde and brown, was caked with ash. She was breathing, but only just, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Clara rushed to her side, knees hitting the earth hard. "Hey, sweetheart, can you hear me?" she called, voice gentle but firm, the way she'd practiced on every lost hiker, every panicked camper. The girl's eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. Chestnut circled once, then backed away, snorting and pawing at the ground. Clara's training kicked in. She checked the girl's pulse, thready but there, then scanned for injuries. Scrapes covered her arms, and her left ankle was twisted at an odd angle. Clara dug into her backpack for the first aid kit, hands working quickly, wrapping the girl's ankle with makeshift splints made from pine branches. "Stay with me," Clara whispered. "You're not alone. Help's here." The girl's lips parted, a broken sound escaping. Help?" As Clara worked, a flash of memory stabbed through her. Her brother, lost and scared, somewhere in woods just like these, waiting for help that came too late. The past threatened to overtake her, but Clara forced it back. She wouldn't fail again. Not now. Suddenly, Chestnut pricked his ears and swung his head toward the deeper woods. His entire body tensed. Clara followed his gaze. Somewhere beyond the clearing, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, desperate cry. It was too muffled to understand, but unmistakably human. Chestnut bolted toward the sound, hooves pounding over fallen logs and churning up ash. "No, wait!" Clara called after him. But the stallion was gone, swallowed by the trees, moving with purpose and panic, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Clara hesitated, torn between chasing Chestnut and staying with the injured girl. Duty warred with instinct, but she knew what she had to do. She tore a strip from her own jacket and wrapped it around the girl's wrist, a signal for any searchers who might come, and placed her flashlight beside the girl's hand, switched on and shining. "I'll be right back," she promised, squeezing the girl's cold fingers. "Don't move, I'm coming back for you." With one last look, Clara plunged into the woods after Chestnut. The forest seemed to close around her, branches snagging her hair and jacket, the ground spongy with moss and the char of old fires. She moved fast, following the fresh prints left by the stallion, prints that zigzagged through the undergrowth, erratic yet purposeful. The distant cry sounded again, louder now, echoing through the pines. Clara's heart slammed in her chest. She stumbled through a thicket, nearly tripping over an old, rusted hunting trap, then broke through to another small clearing. There, Chestnut stood frozen, head low, ears flat, staring at something just out of sight. Clara crept closer, heart in her throat. She caught sight of a torn red bandana snagged on a branch, and beyond that, the faint imprint of a child's shoe in the mud. The stallion's sides heaved as he sniffed at the ground, then looked up at Clara with wide, imploring eyes. There was another one out here, not just the girl. The urgency in Chestnut's behavior finally made sense. He wasn't simply running in fear. He was searching, guiding, driven by a desperate knowledge of these trails and the dangers lurking within them. Clara felt a fresh surge of adrenaline. She scanned the shadows, listening for the smallest sound. The wind whipped through the pines, drowning out distant sirens and the crackle of fire. But beneath it, she heard the soft, pitiful whimper of a child. She scrambled toward the noise, crawling under low-hanging boughs and across a patch of ground scarred by animal tracks. But as she moved, another memory surged, the last GPS ping from her brother's phone, a location deep in woods just like these, where the trees pressed close and the silence felt like accusation. For a moment, the terrain looked identical, the air thick with ghosts. She faltered, her hand brushing the compass at her belt. Chestnut nudged her back to focus, nickering softly, as if to remind her that the past could not be changed. But this child now could be saved. Clara steeled herself and pressed forward, breaking through the brush just in time to see a small, trembling figure. Another child, a boy, huddled at the base of a pine, clutching a torn backpack and shivering violently. Clara dropped to her knees, wrapping the boy in her arms, murmuring comfort. His eyes, wide and glazed with terror, met hers, and for an instant she saw her brother again, helpless and lost. She blinked back tears, checking him quickly for injuries, cuts, bruises, but nothing life-threatening. "It's okay. I'm here," she said, her voice trembling. "You're safe now. I've got you." Chestnut watched, standing sentinel, the wind whipping his mane, eyes fixed on the darkness, as if daring it to try anything. Clara gathered the boy in her arms, helping him to his feet, and together they made their way back toward the first clearing, where the girl still lay. As the three emerged from the woods, battered but alive, the firelight glimmered on the horizon, a reminder that time was short, that danger was never far. Clara knew then that Chestnut's urgency had saved them. This wasn't luck. The horse knew these trails. He had seen too much and remembered too well. She looked at Chestnut, gratitude and awe in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice lost in the wind. As she knelt beside the two children, patching wounds and whispering hope, she understood. This rescue was not random. It was a reckoning, and Chestnut, silent and steady, was their unlikely guide, through fear, through memory, and, if they were lucky, all the way home. The return to Clara's ranger cabin felt like surfacing from a nightmare. The forest behind them still churned with wind and smoke, but inside the rustic walls, everything slowed. Rain tapped steadily on the tin roof, soothing after the chaos of flames and frantic footsteps. Clara's boots left muddy prints on the old floorboards as she guided the two rescued children inside, her every movement careful and deliberate. Harper Lennox, the girl Chestnut had led her to, was barely conscious, her breaths shallow, hair matted with pine needles and soot. Clara wrapped her in a thermal blanket and eased her down onto the narrow cot by the window. The boy, younger and shivering, clung to her arm until she coaxed him into a dry ranger's hoodie and set him up with a mug of instant cocoa, his small hands trembling more from shock than cold. Chestnut, having fulfilled his urgent mission, now stood quietly outside, grazing on the patchy grass just beyond the cabin's porch. Rain softened the dried blood on his flanks, the sound of his chewing a gentle counterpoint to the storm. Clara glanced out the window every few minutes, as if afraid he might disappear as suddenly as he'd arrived. Inside, the silence stretched. The radio hissed with static, unable to cut through the storm. Clara cleaned Harper's cuts with gentle hands, her mind churning with worry about the fire, about Chestnut, about what had truly happened out in those woods. She caught herself trembling as she wrapped a bandage around Harper's wrist, her fingers less steady than she'd like. To keep herself from spiraling, Clara grabbed her battered sketchbook from the shelf. She sat at the kitchen table, angling the lamp toward the window, and began to draw Chestnut as he grazed in the rain. Each pencil stroke steadied her breathing, tracing the arch of the stallion's neck, the wild tangles of his mane, the proud lines of his head. Her hand shook, but less with every line, until the act of drawing became a kind of prayer. The boy watched, fascinated, as Chestnut lifted his head and gazed back through the glass, their eyes meeting in the reflection. Clara smiled gently and passed him the pencil. He hesitated, then began to draw beside her, a stick figure with wild hair astride a large, smiling horse. The cabin filled with the soft hush of rain, pencil scratches, and the slow, uncertain rhythm of healing. After a while, Clara set her sketch aside and stood by the window, holding a small brass compass in her palm. It was battered and old, the glass chipped, but she kept it close always, a reminder of her brother, who'd carried it on every hike until the day he disappeared. The compass needle quivered, refusing to point north. Instead, it aimed at the cabin's heart, as if insisting that home wasn't just a direction on a map, but the place where memory and hope met. As the rain intensified, Harper stirred on the cot, her lips moving in restless sleep. Clara knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. Harper's eyelids fluttered. Her mouth opened, and in a hoarse, almost inaudible whisper, she spoke. There was another one. The words jolted Clara like an electric shock. She leaned in closer, desperate to catch more, but Harper slipped back into uneasy dreams, fingers twitching beneath the blanket. Clara's heart pounded. Another one? Another child? Another horse? The possibilities crashed over her, bringing a wave of dread. She turned to the boy, hoping for answers, but he'd curled up under the hoodie, already drifting towards sleep. Outside, Chestnut raised his head, ears pricked toward the cabin, as if he sensed the shift in the air. Clara stepped onto the porch, pulling her jacket tighter, and met his gaze through the rain. The stallion stepped closer, eyes deep with something between wariness and trust. Clara moved slowly, holding out her palm, letting the rain soak her to the skin. Chestnut didn't flinch. He touched her hand with his nose, warm breath mingling with the cool mist. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling more with emotion than cold. She gently traced her fingers over the marks on his halter, the faded brand, the frayed backpack strap still tied in place. "You saved them," she said, feeling the truth settle in her bones. Chestnut blinked, then lowered his head, standing sentinel at the porch's edge as if guarding the children within. Clara returned inside, her mind spinning with questions and unease. The storm's rhythm matched her racing thoughts. She checked the first aid kit, counted the supplies, then sat at the table again, staring at her brother's compass. Was it possible the horse had come for her, not just by chance, but because he knew? Did animals remember grief and loss, too? She remembered her brother's laughter, his teasing, the way he always found his way home no matter how lost they got in the woods. And now, with the fire threatening, with strangers relying on her, she felt his absence more keenly than ever. The hours stretched into late afternoon. The rain slowed, the wind less savage. The girl, Harper, finally woke, blinking in confusion. Clara knelt beside her again, voice gentle but direct. "Hey there. You're safe. My name's Clara. Can you tell me what happened out there?" Harper shook her head, eyes filling with tears. She pressed her face into the blanket. The boy watched, silent, afraid to speak. Clara waited. She didn't push. Instead, she sat by the window and began another sketch. This time, the outline of two children standing side by side, with Chestnut behind them, larger than life, protective. She drew the trees swirling above, the smoke curling at their feet, and finally, the sun breaking through the clouds. It was a picture of hope, of resilience, of being found. Harper spoke at last, voice raw and uncertain. We, we got lost. We tried to run from the fire, the horse. He just showed up, like he knew where we were." She paused, biting her lip. "I thought he was wild, but he waited for us. When I fell, he stayed with me, then ran off. I heard him again. I thought I was dreaming." Clara squeezed her hand. "You're not dreaming. You're safe now." As dusk settled, Clara watched the compass again. It still refused to point north, the needle stubbornly drawn toward the warmth of the cabin. She set it on the windowsill, where it gleamed in the fading light. Home, she thought. Not a place. A promise. When night fell, the forest grew quiet, the wind gentler, the rain a soft lullaby on the roof. Clara sat at the table, sketching by lantern glow, while Harper and the boy slept. Chestnut's silhouette watched from outside, unmoving, a silent guardian in the storm. Clara glanced at the compass, at the children, at the loyal horse. She felt the burden of old grief, but also the stirrings of something new, the possibility that healing, like rescue, could come silently, in the form of a child's whisper or a horse's trust. And as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she clung to that hope, ready for whatever answers the next dawn might bring. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the mountains wore its memory like bruises. The rain had cooled the air, soaking the forest floor until every footstep squelched and every breath tasted of wet pine and distant smoke. Clara stood on the porch, arms crossed, scanning the dark ridge above the ranger cabin. She hadn't slept, just drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, every sound magnified by nerves and responsibility. Inside, the children slept in a fragile peace. Outside, Chestnut waited, his wounds drying but his spirit restless. Clara checked on Harper and the boy one last time before heading out. Harper's fever had broken, and color was returning to her cheeks. The boy curled under a pile of blankets, finally relaxed enough to snore softly. Clara set a note on the table. "Stay inside. Back soon." Then slipped into her boots and grabbed her radio, compass, and a battered thermos of coffee. Chestnut stood near the tree line, ears flicking. As Clara approached, he greeted her with a low nicker, pressing his forehead gently into her palm. In the first clear light, the marks on his body stood out in sharp relief. Long, shallow cuts crisscrossed his flanks and shoulders, some fresh and some old, healed to white lines. Clara's breath caught. These weren't the marks of simple forest accidents. They told a story of violence, of someone pushing the stallion past his breaking point. She spoke quietly, soothing him with her voice as she checked the worst of the wounds. Chestnut flinched at her touch, then slowly leaned into her hand. There was a shudder that rippled through his body, a trust so fragile it almost broke her heart. "You're all right, big guy," she whispered. "You're safe now." Chestnut snorted, then jerked his head toward a game trail at the edge of the ridge, pawing at the ground. It was as if something beyond the trees called to him, something urgent, unresolved. Clara clipped a makeshift lead rope to his halter, grabbed her pack, and followed him along the narrow path. The earth here was scarred, gouged by old landslides, and the undergrowth tangled with thorny brush. The climb was slow. Mist clung to the ground in thin sheets, swirling around Clara's boots and Chestnut's hooves. Every few steps, the horse would pause, snorting at the ground, eyes searching the shadows, as if looking for ghosts. Once he spooked at the sudden flutter of a bird's wings, but Clara steadied him with a firm hand and a few murmured words. Their progress was careful but determined, two wounded souls navigating a world that had not been kind. At the base of a steep ravine, Chestnut balked, stomping and tossing his head. Clara looked closer and saw the ground pocked with hoofprints, some fresh, others nearly washed away by last night's rain. The trail ahead was treacherous, the soil loose and riddled with hidden dangers. Clara crouched down examining the prints and spotted something half buried beneath a tangle of dead leaves. A set of broken leather reins snapped clean through. Nearby, a metal whistle, government issue, the kind given to search and rescue patrols, gleamed dully in the weak sunlight. Clara's stomach turned. This wasn't a random trail. Someone had been here, someone official. She remembered her brother's voice, full of excitement the day he received his own government whistle, and her hands trembled as she picked up the relics. She studied Chestnut, noting the way he watched the ridge with a haunted look. The horse had not run wild. He had escaped from something brutal, maybe something ongoing. Chestnut nudged the whistle with his nose, then pressed against Clara's side, seeking comfort. She knelt and wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the tremor beneath his skin. "It's okay," she murmured, but her own confidence was shaky. There was a story here, one that ran deeper than a single night of terror and rescue. The trail snaked higher, winding along the scarred edge of the ridge. Every turn revealed new evidence of past chaos. A patch of singed earth, twisted wire caught in a tree, a scrap of blue cloth snagged on a thorn. Chestnut's wounds began to bleed again, tiny droplets dotting the stones. Clara paused to wash and dress them with strips torn from her shirt, tying the makeshift bandages with gentle fingers. The horse accepted her care without protest, trembling with exhaustion. At the top of the ridge, the world opened up, a panoramic view of the valley below, with smoke curling on the horizon and the sun glinting off wet treetops. Clara took a moment to catch her breath, resting her hand on Chestnut's shoulder. For the first time since yesterday's chaos, she felt the tiniest sliver of hope, fragile but real. Suddenly, Chestnut pricked his ears and whinnied, loud and sharp. Clara followed his gaze and spotted a series of hoofprints, fresher than the rest, leading down a narrow game trail. The ground here was churned up, as if there'd been a struggle. Bits of broken leather and shredded fabric littered the path. Clara crouched to examine the ground, her ranger's eye catching every detail. Tufts of Chestnut's hair, flecks of dried blood, and further along, a boot print too large for a child, likely a man's. She reached for her radio, hesitating before speaking. "Base, this is Monroe. Found evidence of a struggle. Possible injured animal and human. Proceeding to investigate." No answer. The radio crackled, then fell silent. Clara bit her lip, torn between fear and the certainty that this was a turning point. As they pressed on, Chestnut's trust grew. He moved more confidently, sticking close to Clara's side. At one point, a fallen tree blocked their way. Clara clambered over it, then coaxed Chestnut with gentle words and outstretched hands. The stallion hesitated, then leapt, landing heavily but steady on the other side. Clara beamed at him, pride swelling in her chest. In a small clearing, they stumbled upon another clue, a tattered patch from a ranger's uniform, ground into the mud. Clara picked it up, her throat tightening as she recognized the insignia from her brother's old vest. Her hands shook, but she tucked the patch into her pocket. Chestnut snorted, nosing her arm as if sensing her turmoil. They continued along the ravine, the trail narrowing until only a deer could pass. Clara stopped, realizing they had reached the limit. She squatted beside Chestnut, stroking his mane, searching his eyes for answers. The stallion leaned into her touch, his shivering easing as the sun warmed their backs. For a moment, there was only peace. Quiet, broken only by the call of a distant jay and the soft sighing of the wind. Clara whispered a promise to the horse and to her brother, to keep searching, to keep fighting for the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. As they turned to head back toward the cabin, Chestnut walked beside her, matching her pace stride for stride. There was no need for reins or commands. They understood each other now, bound by wounds both visible and hidden, and by a shared determination to see justice done, whatever that might cost. The sky over Redwater had turned a peculiar bruised color by midday, clouds bunching at the peaks as if waiting for a signal to break loose. Clara and Chestnut wound their way back down the ravine, the horse's wounds freshly bandaged, both moving with a sense of newfound trust and an unspoken urgency that pressed them forward. Every so often, Clara glanced over her shoulder, uneasy. She couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone. Each snap of a twig or flutter of wings seemed heavier now, a possible warning rather than background noise. She paused at the edge of a wide meadow, the kind that felt ancient, with tall grass bowing in the wind and wildflowers stubbornly blooming at the margins. The old fire tower, a crumbling skeleton from another era, loomed at the field's far end. Its shadow stretched long across the grass, almost reaching the line of pine trees where Clara now stood. It had been years since she'd visited the tower. Search parties had once gathered there, swapping stories and rations, before the tragedies and budget cuts left it to rot. Chestnut tensed beside her, ears flat, nostrils twitching. Clara followed his gaze, scanning the field. A lone figure moved among the golden grass, stooped, deliberate. The man was dressed in worn khakis and a faded canvas jacket, beard streaked with gray, hair wild beneath a battered ranger's cap. He walked with a limp, using a gnarled stick as a makeshift cane. Clara's chest tightened in recognition. Elias Drake. Once Elias had been a legend, a wilderness trainer whose voice was law in every Redwater search and rescue op. Then came the accusations, the quiet internal investigation, and his self-imposed exile at the forest's edge. Most folks whispered that Elias knew the woods better than anyone alive, but Clara remembered the way he'd looked at her brother the last time they spoke. Not with concern, but with calculation. As if on cue, Chestnut whinnied, a deep, almost angry sound that echoed through the clearing. He broke away from Clara and charged straight at Elias, muscles bunching, tail high. Clara shouted, "Chestnut, no!" But the horse's hooves thundered across the meadow. Elias didn't run. Instead, he braced himself, raising the stick in warning. Chestnut skidded to a halt just short of the old man, rearing and pawing the air. The two faced off, a challenge, a memory, something old and dangerous sparking between them. Elias's eyes flashed, not with fear, but with grim resolve. With a swift, practiced motion, he deflected Chestnut's charge, sidestepping as if anticipating the stallion's every move. Chestnut lashed out, but Elias managed to fend him off, grunting with effort. Clara sprinted after them, breath ragged. By the time she reached the standoff, Chestnut had lowered his head, sides heaving, and Elias leaned on his stick, glaring at both horse and ranger. "Control your animal, Monroe," he spat, voice gravelly. "That one's trouble, always was." Clara positioned herself between them, keeping a wary eye on Chestnut, who now stood rigid but watchful. "He's not the only one," she shot back, meeting Elias's gaze with equal intensity. "What are you doing out here, Elias? This trail's been closed for months." Elias shrugged, feigning indifference, but his eyes darted to the battered logbook tucked under his arm. "Checking old lines, places crawling with fools who think a fire makes good cover for poaching." He spat in the grass, then looked Chestnut up and down, scorn twisting his mouth. "That horse shouldn't be alive. should have been put down after what he did. Chestnut's ears pinned back, teeth bared. Clara placed a calming hand on his neck, fighting a rush of anger. You don't know what you're talking about. This horse saved 2 kids last night. He's the reason anyone made it out alive. Elias's expression flickered, just for an instant, a crack in his hard shell. He grunted, turning to leave, but as he did, the logbook slipped from his grasp and landed with a muffled thud in the grass. Papers spilled out, fluttering in the wind. Clara lunged to snatch it up before Elias could react. "Give that here," Elias growled, but Clara had already flipped open the cover. Inside, the pages were filled with spidery handwriting, dates, and cold notations. She scanned the entries, each marked with a code, a horse's name, a series of numbers. Then she saw it. A heading, Obedience Trials, Redwater Project. Below, notes about Chestnut. Delta, non-compliant, too reactive, sent for disposal. Clara's blood ran cold. She looked up at Elias, who watched her with a resigned, almost weary malice. "You ran those experiments," she said softly. "You trained these animals, used them up, then got rid of them when they didn't fit your mold." Elias stepped forward, looming. "You don't understand the cost of failure in these woods, Monroe. You train or you die. There's no room for sentiment. Is that what happened to my brother?" The words were out before Clara could stop them, trembling with old hurt. Did he see something he shouldn't have? Elias's face hardened. Accidents happen. Some folks can't let go. He snatched the logbook from her hands, but not before Clara caught another line. Witnessed by S. Monroe. File closed. Before she could press further, Chestnut lunged again, pushing between Clara and Elias, protective. Elias stumbled back, raising his stick defensively. "Get that beast out of here before I put him down for good," he shouted, but his voice was laced with fear now, not just anger. Clara pulled Chestnut away, backing slowly toward the trees. She kept her eyes on Elias, whose mask had cracked, showing the frightened man beneath the legend. "Stay away from us," she warned, voice low and steady. "If I find out you had anything to do with the disappearances, or with what happened to my brother," Elias spat again, retreating toward the tower. "You'll wish you never started asking questions, Monroe. Some things in these woods are best left buried." With that, he limped away, vanishing into the tall grass, leaving Clara and Chestnut alone in the meadow, the logbook clutched tight in her hand, and a chill settling deep in her bones. Clara knelt beside Chestnut, stroking his trembling shoulder. The stallion pressed close, eyes wide with trust and terror. She thumbed through the logbook, reading entries that painted a picture of cruelty, control, and secrets kept for years. Obedience trials, forced marches, the disposal of animals labeled defective. And buried in the middle, her brother's name, never explained, just closed. For a long moment, Clara watched the fire tower, its shadow like a warning. The wind bent the grass around them, and Chestnut's body blocked the chill. She realized then what true courage was, not just surviving, but refusing to look away when the truth finally stepped into the light. She stood and led Chestnut back toward the cabin, the logbook pressed to her chest, her heart aching but resolute. The past was coming for her now, faster and closer with every step, but she would face it, not just for herself or for her brother, but for Chestnut and every silent soul left to wander these woods, waiting for someone to finally listen. The cabin felt different when Clara and Chestnut returned. Rainwater glistened on the porch, and the distant rumble of thunder still lingered over the peaks. But inside, the mood was changed, charged with the electricity of revelation, and the quiet hope that comes with having a piece of the truth in your hands. Clara laid the logbook down on the table, wiping mud and sweat from her brow, and took a long, shaky breath. Harper was sitting up now, her cheeks no longer as pale. Watching Clara with wide, uncertain eyes, the boy peeked over the edge of the blanket, clutching the mug of cocoa like a lifeline. Are we safe?" he whispered. Clara forced a reassuring smile. "You are. Both of you." Her gaze drifted to Chestnut, who stood just outside the door, close enough to be called inside, but still needing the world, the wind, and the freedom of open space. She let him be for now. He had earned that much trust. She moved to the small cabinet in the corner, where she kept a battered file box crammed with years of ranger records, search logs, old maps, handwritten notes from past seasons, and faded photos of lost hikers and reunions. Clara sifted through the contents, her hands trembling as she recognized her brother's handwriting. Looping, confident, younger. Each note was a fragment of another life. East Ridge, elk sighted, avalanche risk near old mine, bring apples for the chestnut. Won't touch carrots. She paused on the last one, her breath catching. The chestnut. The words felt prophetic now. With the logbook open beside her, Clara started matching entries, names, dates, coordinates, trails she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The further she dug, the more the truth crystallized. Chestnut, once tagged as Delta, had been part of a controversial training program funded by some now-defunct government agency. Dozens of horses had been brought in, but only a handful survived the obedience trials. The rest, like the people who went missing in these woods, were erased by bureaucratic indifference. Her eyes traced a line in her brother's notes, written 3 days before he disappeared. Frightened horse at North Bend. Refuses to cross creek. Says he sees something in the water, refuses orders. Horse branded, Delta. Keep watch. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth, heart thudding. The memories she'd spent years burying came rushing back. That last search, the one that went wrong, was never really about equipment failure or weather or bad luck. It was about a horse. This horse. Her brother saw what was happening. He'd known Chestnut, had tried to protect him, and maybe paid the ultimate price for what he learned. Outside, the rain stopped, leaving the air crisp and washed clean. Clara grabbed her brother's old expedition vest from a hook by the door, running her fingers over the faded patch on the shoulder. The one he'd always joked was his lucky badge. She unpinned the patch, swallowing the lump in her throat, and stepped outside, vest in one hand, patch in the other. Chestnut raised his head as she approached. For a moment, she just stood there, watching the mountains reflected in the horse's wide, intelligent eyes. He watched her just as closely, muscles taut, waiting. Clara moved slowly, showing him the patch, letting him smell it. He blew out a warm breath, touching the cloth with his nose, then nudged her gently. With careful fingers, Clara pinned the patch to the saddle blanket. Her brother's badge, now Chestnut's. It felt right. A new kind of bond, a silent promise. Chestnut stood straighter, a soft wicker escaping his throat. In that moment, Clara felt the impossible. Her brother's spirit, Chestnut's memory, and her own grief braided together in a fragile thread of hope. Inside, Harper and the boy watched from the window, silent witnesses to a moment that felt almost sacred. Clara knelt beside Chestnut, pressing her forehead to his shoulder, tears finally spilling over. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything they did, for not seeing sooner. You were always more than just a horse to them, weren't you? You remembered." Chestnut shifted his weight, leaning into her, steady and forgiving. The sky above them cleared, letting golden sunlight spill over the ridge. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt the grip of grief loosen its hold. When she finally stood, she made her way back inside, determination burning in her veins. There were still so many unanswered questions about the training program, about Elias Drake, about the fate of others like Chestnut. But she knew what she had to do. Justice, real justice, would mean bringing the truth into daylight. Clara returned to the logbook, tracing the names of the other horses. Bravo, Echo, Foxtrot. Each entry was followed by a cold, clinical fate. Sold, euthanized, lost in field trial. But Chestnut's story was different. His was marked non-compliant, sent for disposal. Yet he survived, found his way back, and became a lifeline for those the world had given up on. A knock at the door startled her. She grabbed the radio, but it only buzzed with static. When she opened the door, Harper was standing there, eyes wide and full of pain. "I remember something," the girl whispered. "When we were hiding in the woods, I heard voices. Someone was yelling at the horse, calling him names, throwing rocks. But he kept coming back to us. He was scared, but he wouldn't leave." Clara knelt, meeting Harper's gaze. "You're very brave, Harper. So is Chestnut." She felt a new surge of protectiveness, not just for the children, but for the horse whose loyalty and suffering had gone unrecognized for too long. She dug deeper into the archives, searching for anything that might link Elias Drake directly to the program. Her brother's last field report included a single sentence. "Met with ED at Ridge Base. Discussed issues with Delta's behavior. ED recommends stricter measures." Clara's hands shook as she made the connection. Elias had been involved, maybe even leading the operation. The logbook was her evidence. As the afternoon faded into evening, Clara pieced together a timeline, her mind sharp with focus. Chestnut had refused to obey orders, had witnessed something at the creek that terrified him. Her brother, trying to shield the animal, had run afoul of the program's brutal policies, and now, years later, it was Chestnut's memory, his refusal to forget or obey blindly, that had brought the truth out of hiding. Clara stood and looked at Chestnut, now grazing peacefully outside, the badge on his saddle blanket catching the last rays of sunlight. She knew, with sudden clarity, that the next step was not just about rescue, but about justice for everyone who had suffered in silence, animal and human alike. As dusk settled, she gathered her notes, the logbook, her brother's compass, and Chestnut's bridle, preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. Harper and the boy sat quietly, drawing horses and trees in the lamplight, finally at peace. Outside, Chestnut watched the cabin, ears pricked, the patch from her brother's vest rustling on his blanket. He was the missing link, the silent witness whose scars and courage had bridged the gap between past and present. Clara made herself a vow as she locked up for the night. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would stand with Chestnut. She would speak the truth, no matter who tried to silence it.